I rented a cabin deep in the woods because I wanted time alone. I had been working non-stop and thought being away from everything would give me some peace. The place was small and old but had what I needed. A single bedroom, a kitchen with old appliances, a living room with a wood stove, and a bathroom with a weak shower. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. The cabin sat about a quarter mile from a dirt road, hidden by trees. I thought that meant I would have quiet. The first night felt normal. I cooked a simple meal, sat on the couch, and read. The silence outside was heavy, broken only by the crack of branches or wind moving through the trees. I went to bed with the window cracked for fresh air, listening to crickets and owls. The next morning, when I stepped out, I noticed something odd. The dirt around the porch looked disturbed, like someone had walked there during the night. The prints weren't clear, just shallow impressions, but they circled the porch and then disappeared into the woods. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer nosing around. I tried not to think about it. During the day, I hiked the trails nearby. The forest was thick, with moss covering the ground and tall trees shutting out much of the sun. I didn't see another person the whole day. By the time I got back to the cabin, I was sweaty and tired. I cooked again, locked the door, and read until it was late. That night, I woke up suddenly. No sound had startled me. I just woke. The cabin felt different, heavier. I lay still and listened. The air outside was silent, too silent. Then I heard something faint. A slow crunch of leaves near the porch. Stopped for a while, then started again, moving around the cabin. The steps weren't quick or nervous. They were steady, like someone was circling, taking their time. I froze in bed. I waited, heart hammering, until the noise stopped. I thought about turning on the outside light, but didn't want to draw attention. Eventually, I fell asleep again, though not fully. In the morning, I stepped outside and saw clearer prints in the damp soil. These weren't animal tracks. They looked like shoe prints, narrow and long. They circled the cabin more than once. My stomach sank. I scanned the woods but saw nothing. I thought about leaving then, but part of me reasoned it was nothing. Maybe a hunter had wandered too close. Maybe some local was curious. I didn't want to believe it was anything more. The second night was worse. I kept the outside light on. Around midnight, I heard the sound again. This time it was closer, almost against the wall. Then came a soft scrape, like a hand dragging along the wood siding. I sat up in bed, sweating, staring at the door. The scrape moved around the cabin slowly. When it reached the bedroom wall, I swore I heard a faint breath through the thin wood. I barely slept. By morning, my nerves were shot. I walked around the cabin and saw more prints, fresh, pressed deep into the soil. Someone had been standing right outside my bedroom window. That day, I tried to distract myself by hiking again, but I couldn't focus. I kept checking over my shoulder, thinking I saw movement in the trees. Once, I thought I caught a glimpse of a figure, tall, thin, slipping behind a tree far back. I told myself my mind was playing tricks. I went back earlier than planned. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and kept a kitchen knife on the nightstand. I sat in the living room with the stove burning, light spilling out the window. Hours passed. I almost convinced myself nothing would happen. Then, close to midnight, there was a sound on the porch. Not just footsteps, a slow creak of the wooden boards. Whoever it was, they were standing right at the door. I held my breath. The door rattled lightly, like someone tested the knob. It didn't turn because I had locked it, but the attempt was deliberate. After a pause, the sound of slow steps moved along the porch, then around the cabin again. I stayed up the whole night, gripping the knife, eyes on the door. When dawn finally came, I saw something that made my chest tighten. On the door, just above the knob, was a smudge, a greasy handprint, long fingers. It hadn't been there before. That morning, I packed my things fast. I didn't care that I had booked the place for another week. I stuffed everything into my bag, tossed it in the car, and drove. When I looked in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw movement on the tree line near the cabin, like someone thin and tall standing half-hidden, but I didn't slow down. I drove straight out of those woods and didn't look back again. The cabin owner later asked why I left early. I never explained, but I know what I heard, and I know what I saw. Someone had been watching, circling the cabin night after night, waiting. If I had stayed one more night, maybe the lock wouldn't have been enough. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. When we booked the cabin, it seemed like a perfect getaway. It was listed as remote, quiet, surrounded by forest, and far enough from any main roads that we could feel away from everything. The pictures showed a log cabin with a small porch, a fire pit outside, and a cozy living room with a fireplace. The listing mentioned Wi-Fi and said the cabin had everything needed for a comfortable stay. That mattered because even though we wanted peace, we still wanted to check in with family and have some way to connect if we needed to. We drove for hours to get there. The last stretch was down a gravel road lined with trees that grew so thick they formed a kind of tunnel overhead. When the GPS told us we had arrived, the cabin appeared between the trees, just as it looked in the pictures. The wood siding was dark, the roof steep, and there was a single light by the front door. It looked inviting in that way that remote cabins do, like it was made to give you shelter from everything outside. Inside, the air was cool, faintly smelling of pine and dust. We dropped our bags and walked through the rooms. There was one main room with a couch, a small dining table, and the fireplace. The kitchen was tucked to the side with a few shelves of dishes and pots. The bedrooms were small, with simple beds covered in quilts. It felt basic but fine, like the kind of place where you didn't need much more than food and warmth. The first thing I noticed was my phone had no signal. I held it up, walked around the cabin, even stepped onto the porch, but there was nothing, not even one bar. Everyone else tried too, with the same result. That's when we tried the Wi-Fi. The router was there, plugged into the wall, but the network didn't show up. The box had lights on, but no matter what we did, we couldn't get any connection. First, we laughed it off. We had come out there to disconnect anyway, and being unreachable almost felt like part of the experience. Still, I couldn't shake the thought that if anything went wrong, we had no way of calling anyone. No backup, no lifeline. As the sun went down, the woods grew darker than I expected. Without streetlights or houses nearby, the only light came from the moon through the trees. The air cooled fast, and the forest around us grew so quiet that every snap of a twig stood out sharp. We lit a fire in the fireplace and tried to settle in for the night. By midnight, everyone had gone to bed. I was still awake, lying under the quilt in one of the small bedrooms. The silence pressed in thick, broken only by the occasional crack from the fire dying down. I was just starting to drift off when I heard it, the faint sound of the front door handle moving. At first I thought it was part of a dream, but then I heard it again clearer. The rattle of metal, slow, deliberate. Someone was trying the handle. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. My first thought was that maybe one of my friends had gotten up, maybe to get water or step outside. But then I remembered the way the door had sounded when we came in earlier. It had a heavy latch, and the handle made a distinct metallic noise. This was the same sound, but slower, like someone testing it carefully. The noise stopped for a few seconds. Then came a faint push against the wood, a slight creak as if weight leaned against the door. Whoever it was wasn't just testing the handle, they were checking if it would give. I lay there, heart pounding, listening. I could hear the wind outside, the soft creaks of the cabin, and then again, that slow rattle. The thought that someone was right outside the front door, in the middle of nowhere, with no phone signal and no way to call for help, hit me hard. I didn't move. I just listened, waiting. The handle shifted again, one final slow turn, but the lock held. After a while, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse, because I didn't know if whoever it was had walked away or was still standing there in the dark, waiting. I barely slept. Every sound made me flinch. Every creak felt like footsteps. When dawn finally came, I got up and checked the door. The lock was still latched, but when I looked closely, I saw faint smudges on the handle. They weren't ours. We had barely touched it after coming in, and now there were fresh streaks of dirt, as if someone had gripped it with a dirty hand. The others thought maybe it was an animal, but animals don't try door handles. Animals scratch or push. This had been deliberate. The rest of the morning, we couldn't shake the unease. The woods didn't feel peaceful anymore. They felt empty in a way that made you realize how far you were from help. The fact that we had no phone signal became more of a problem than an inconvenience. We debated leaving early. Part of us wanted to pretend it was nothing, to stay and not waste the trip. But every time I looked at that door, I thought about how easy it would have been for someone stronger or more determined to force their way in. I thought about what would have happened if the lock hadn't held. By noon, we were packing. No one argued. We loaded up the car quickly, glancing around the trees as if expecting to see someone watching us. The gravel road felt longer on the way out, every turn making us breathe a little easier as we got closer to town. When we finally had phone service again, I reported the incident to the rental site. I explained that someone had tried the door during the night, that we felt unsafe, that the Wi-Fi listed wasn't even working. They said they'd reach out to the host, but I never found out if they got an explanation. What stayed with me wasn't just the noise at the door. It was the realization that we had been completely cut off. No phones, no Wi-Fi, no neighbors within shouting distance. If that door had opened, there would have been nothing we could do but try to fight or run into the woods. The cabin had looked peaceful when we arrived, like a safe escape from the world. But that night showed me how quickly peace can turn into vulnerability. What seemed like quiet isolation was really just being exposed, with nothing between us and whoever decided to come to that door except one thin lock. I'll never forget lying in that bed, listening to the slow turn of the handle, realizing someone was out there, trying to come in, while we had no way to reach anyone. That helplessness stuck with me more than anything. It taught me that sometimes the scariest thing isn't the dark woods themselves. It's knowing that if danger comes to the door, you're completely on your own. When I booked the cabin, I thought it would be the perfect escape. I had been working nonstop for months, sleeping badly, eating worse, and feeling like I was grinding myself down to nothing. The cabin was advertised as remote, quiet, and private. That was exactly what I wanted. I didn't want neighbors. I didn't want traffic. I didn't want to hear the hum of a city or the drone of voices in a coffee shop. I just wanted silence, space, and the kind of air you only get when you are surrounded by trees. The drive out took me most of the day. I followed paved roads for hours before they thinned into two-lane highways, and eventually the pavement turned to packed gravel. Dust coated the sides of my car and the windshield, and the branches from overhanging trees scraped lightly against the roof as I wound deeper into the woods. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was already starting to dip behind the treetops. The place looked smaller than the pictures had made it seem, but still sturdy. Dark wood, a simple front porch with 2 old chairs, a single window in the front, and a chimney that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was no cell signal when I checked my phone, not even a bar. That wasn't a surprise, the ad had mentioned it. Still, it felt strange knowing I couldn't just text someone if something came up. It was just me out there, with nothing but the trees for company. Inside, the cabin was bare bones. A small kitchen with a gas stove and a few mismatched pans. A living area with a sagging couch, a wooden table, and a cold fireplace. The bedroom was just big enough for a bed and a dresser. Everything smelled faintly of old wood and dust, like it hadn't been aired out in months. The first night was quiet. I cooked a simple meal, sat on the porch while the sky went black, and listened to crickets. It was so dark out there that I couldn't even see the tree line, just blackness pressing in on all sides. When I finally went to bed, it felt almost too quiet, like my ears were straining for a sound that never came. The second night, I noticed something. I had gone to bed around the same time, maybe a little later, and I woke up around 2 in the morning. I wasn't sure why. Maybe a dream, maybe nothing. But when I opened my eyes, I thought I heard something faint outside. It wasn't animals. I'd grown up camping, and I knew the difference between a raccoon rummaging or a deer moving through brush. This sounded steady. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. I held my breath, straining to listen. They weren't on the porch, at least not yet, but they were close. Crunches on the leaves, then silence, then another crunch. They seemed to circle the cabin. I lay there for what felt like an hour, muscle stiff, listening to those faint movements outside. Eventually, they stopped, I told myself it had to be my imagination, maybe a deer after all, and I finally fell back asleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to look around. The ground around the cabin was covered in leaves, so there wasn't much to see, but I thought I spotted what looked like the faint shape of a boot print near the corner of the porch. It was deep enough to not be an animal. That unsettled me. I spent the day trying to brush it off. I hiked a little on a path that led down from the cabin into the woods. The trail wasn't marked, but it seemed to wind toward a small stream. The silence out there was heavy, broken only by the occasional bird or the rustle of branches in the wind. I didn't see a single other person. By the time I got back, the sun was already going down again. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were closer. I heard the boards of the porch creak softly. My chest tightened as I lay in the dark, barely breathing. Whoever it was stood there for a long time. I never heard a knock, never heard them try the door, but I could hear the faintest shift of weight on the wooden planks. Then nothing. I stayed awake until the light started bleeding through the curtains, my eyes burning with exhaustion. By the fourth day, I couldn't pretend anymore that it was nothing. Someone was coming to the cabin at night. Someone who didn't want me to know they were there. I thought about leaving, but the idea of driving those narrow gravel roads in the dark wasn't appealing. And in daylight, everything looked calm and harmless. I convinced myself I could handle one more night. I barricaded the door with the table from the living room, sliding it against the frame so tightly it scraped the wood. I checked the window locks twice. Then I sat on the couch with the fire poker across my lap, waiting. It didn't take long. Around 1 in the morning, I heard the footsteps again. Slow, steady, circling. My heart hammered in my chest. Then came the sound of someone pressing on the door. The wood shifted against the table. Not a kick, not an attack, just steady pressure like they were testing it. Then silence. Minutes dragged by. I kept my eyes on the door, gripping the poker so tightly my hands ached. Suddenly, there was a sound at the window. Not glass breaking, but the soft thud of someone touching it, tapping it lightly. I froze. They moved from window to window, pausing at each one. I realized they were checking, testing for weaknesses. Eventually, the noises stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, body rigid, ears tuned to every creak of the cabin. When daylight finally came, I pushed the table aside and opened the door. On the porch, in the dirt just beyond the steps, were clear boot prints. Fresh. They weren't mine. That was enough. I packed everything as fast as I could, tossing clothes into my bag, not even bothering to fold anything. I kept the poker by my side the whole time. When I walked out to the car, the woods felt different, heavy, watchful. The drive back down the gravel road felt endless. Every time I slowed for a curve, I half expected to see someone step out from the trees. But I didn't. I kept driving until I hit pavement, and then I drove faster, not stopping until I was nearly 2 hours away and finally had cell service again. I never reported it. I didn't know what I would even say. No one broke in. Nothing was stolen. But I know someone was out there. They knew I was alone. They waited until dark. They tested the door, the windows. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't blocked that door, or if I had fallen asleep more deeply. I'll never go back to a cabin that remote again. I booked the cabin without thinking too much about it. It wasn't a big vacation plan or some carefully arranged getaway. I just needed space, time, and a break from everything that had been piling up in my life. The description was simple. Small cabin, deep in the woods, running water, electricity from a generator, quiet, private. That last word, private, was the one that made me choose it. The drive out there took almost the whole day. I started on highways, then county roads, then narrow strips of pavement that seemed to get worse with every mile. Eventually, pavement gave way to gravel, and the GPS stopped working. The only directions I had were written down from the host's email. Take the gravel road for 6 miles, pass a rusted mailbox, and then turn onto an even smaller road. That road was little more than 2 tire ruts pressed into the dirt. The forest pressed close on both sides, trees leaning overhead until the sunlight broke into slivers. When I finally saw the cabin, I stopped the car and just sat there for a moment. It looked small and old, tucked back between the trees. The roof sagged a little, the wood was dark with age, and the porch was tilted. There was nothing around it. No other houses, no barns, no sounds of people. Just trees, endless in every direction. Inside, the place was bare bones. A main room with a table, a small couch, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom with a single bed, thin mattress, and a dresser. The kitchen had an old gas stove and a few pots stacked in a cabinet. Everything smelled like wood, dust, and something faintly damp, like rainwater that had seeped in too many times. I unpacked slowly, setting my bag by the bed. The silence was the first thing I noticed. It wasn't the kind of silence you get in a house in the city, where you can still hear traffic or neighbors or airplanes. This was total silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the cabin itself or the distant call of a bird. First, it was calming. Later, I would realize how heavy that silence could become. The first night passed without issue. I sat on the porch after dinner and watched the sun sink through the trees. The sky went dark faster than I expected, and soon it was pitch black. I couldn't even see past the first few trees in front of me. I went inside, locked the door, and tried to sleep. The bed was stiff, but exhaustion helped. The second night was when I first felt it. I woke up sometime past midnight, not sure why. My eyes opened in the dark, and the first thing I noticed was that I was holding my breath. That's not something you usually notice unless something feels wrong. I lay there, perfectly still, listening. At first, I thought I heard the faint crunch of leaves outside, like something moving slowly through the woods. It wasn't steady, not the constant rustling of an animal, but slow and spaced out, like footsteps. I told myself it could be a deer or some other animal, but my body didn't believe it. My chest was tight, my hands clammy, my ears straining for every sound. The crunching moved closer, then faded. Eventually, I must have drifted back to sleep, though it was restless and shallow. In the morning, everything seemed normal. I stepped outside and walked around the cabin, but the ground was layered thick with leaves and pine needles. If there were prints, I couldn't tell. I tried to put it out of my mind. During the day, the forest looked harmless. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, birds called, and the air smelled clean. I spent the afternoon hiking a little trail that led downhill to a stream. I sat there for a while, listening to the water, trying to convince myself I was overthinking. That night, the footsteps returned. This time I was awake when they started. I had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to relax. It began with the faint crunch again, then another, slowly circling the cabin. My skin prickled. I didn't move. I didn't even want to breathe too loudly. The steps came closer, then onto the porch itself. The wooden boards gave a long, low groan under the weight. I froze. Whoever it was didn't knock. They didn't try the door. They just stood there. I could hear the shift of weight on the porch planks, the faint creak as they moved slightly. Time stretched out unbearably long. Then, slowly, the sound faded away. I stayed awake the rest of the night, staring at the door. The silence that followed was worse than the footsteps. The next morning, I noticed something. Near the base of the porch steps, pressed into the dirt, was the faint outline of a boot print. Not mine. It was angled toward the cabin. My stomach sank. This wasn't an animal. Someone had been there. I thought about leaving right then, but pride or stupidity kept me there. I told myself maybe it was a hiker someone lost, maybe a hunter passing through. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, even though my body already knew better. That evening, I made a point of moving the heavy table against the front door. It scraped loudly across the floorboards as I shoved it into place. I checked the windows, making sure the old latches were set. The generator hummed faintly outside, the only sign of modern comfort. Around midnight, the footsteps came again. This time, they didn't circle. They went straight to the door. The boards creaked, the handle rattled softly, and then came the heavy, steady push against the door. The table shuddered against the weight. My heart slammed so hard in my chest it felt like it would burst. I gripped the fire poker in my hand, sitting on the couch in the dark, waiting. The pressure lasted only a few seconds, then stopped. I heard slow steps moving toward the windows, a faint tap against the glass, then another. They were checking every entry, testing, searching. I stayed perfectly still, barely even blinking, until the sounds faded again. When morning came, I didn't hesitate. I packed everything quickly, shoving clothes into my bag, tossing pots back into the cupboard without care. My hands shook the entire time. I shoved the bag into the car, started the engine, and drove as fast as I dared down that narrow dirt road. I didn't look in the mirrors. I didn't stop until I hit paved road miles later. Only then did I check my phone, watching the signal bars crawl back onto the screen. Relief flooded me just knowing I could call for help if I needed to. I never told anyone the full story. I didn't file a report, didn't contact the owner. What would I even say? That someone came to the cabin at night, stood on the porch and tested the doors and windows? Nothing was stolen, nothing was broken. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw in the dirt. Someone was out there, watching, waiting, trying to see if they could get inside. The cabin was supposed to be private. It was too private, and I'll never go back to a place like that again. I booked the cabin because it looked private and quiet, tucked high up in the mountains with nothing but trees around it. The listing showed an old wooden place, single story, with a porch that wrapped halfway around. I thought it would be the perfect getaway from work and city noise. My partner and I drove up during the afternoon, winding through switchbacks and gravel roads until we finally reached it. The driveway was uneven and narrow, cut into the hillside, and it was lined with tall pines that seemed to swallow the light as the sun dropped lower. By the time we unloaded our bags and groceries, the forest already felt heavier than the photos had shown. It was darker, quieter, and it seemed like every sound echoed off the trees. The inside of the cabin smelled of old wood and dust, though it had been cleaned before we arrived. The bedroom was at the end of a short hallway, tucked away behind a simple wooden door with a brass knob. The bed creaked a little when we set our bags on it, but it was sturdy enough. We made a small dinner, sat on the porch until the light drained from the sky, and listened to how loud the silence became once night settled in. It wasn't the kind of quiet I was used to. It wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that made you more aware of yourself, like something was waiting just beyond the reach of sight. We went to bed around midnight. The forest outside was completely black. No streetlights, no glow from neighboring cabins, nothing. Only the faint silver outline of the trees against the sky. I remember checking the locks twice. The front door had an old sliding bolt above the handle, and the back door in the kitchen had one too. The windows were closed tight, curtains drawn. I thought that was enough. Sometime after falling asleep, I woke up to the sound. It was sharp and thin, like nails dragging against wood. I froze, pressing my head deeper into the pillow to make sure I was hearing it right. It came again, scratching. Slow at first, then quicker, almost like a shuffle or scrape. It was coming from the other side of our bedroom door. I didn't move. I just lay there, my chest tight, listening. The bed was against the wall farthest from the door, so I couldn't see it, but I could hear it. The sound was too deliberate to be the house creaking. It was right there, a few feet away, separated from me only by a thin sheet of wood. For a long time, it stopped, and I thought maybe I had imagined it. But just when my body started to ease, the noise came again, harder this time, dragging across the door in long strokes. The weight of it was clear, as if something was pressing its whole hand or paw against the wood. My skin prickled. The cabin had no pets, no animals inside. I knew that, and whatever was making that sound wasn't small. It wasn't the scratching of a mouse or a raccoon clawing at the outside wall. It was heavier, slower, more intentional. The knob didn't turn, but the scratches stayed steady, like something trying to get in or mark the door. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I stayed still, staring at the faint glow of moonlight pushing through the curtains. The sound faded eventually, but I never fully relaxed. I could hear faint movements outside, like soft thuds against the porch. Then nothing, just silence and the ringing of my own ears. When morning finally came, I felt drained, like I had been awake for days. My partner was pale, clearly shaken too, though neither of us said anything out loud. I got up first and went to the door. The wood was scarred. 4 or 5 long vertical scrapes, deep enough to flake splinters, ran down the center of the bedroom door. The marks were raw, fresh, cutting straight into the varnish. I touched them lightly, and the wood dust crumbled off beneath my fingertip. I walked to the front of the cabin, my stomach sinking before I even opened the door. The porch boards had a trail of dark, wet mud. The prints weren't neat like shoes. They weren't clean like bare feet either. They were smeared, wide at the base, narrowing into long streaks, as if something had dragged across with weight. They led straight up the steps, across the porch, and ended right in front of the bedroom wall. The air outside was cold, carrying the damp smell of pine and earth. I crouched low and studied the marks. They weren't paw prints like you'd see from a dog. They weren't the round pads of a bear either. They looked closer to feet, but wider, heavier, pressed down into the wood so hard the mud stuck deep in the grain. I followed the trail back across the porch, down the steps, and into the dirt driveway. From there, the smears scattered into the forest floor where the ground turned thick with needles and moss. The tracks vanished into the trees. The cabin sat far enough off the road that nobody would be wandering up there by accident. The nearest house was miles down. No cars had passed in the night. There was no reason for anyone or anything to be near that cabin. The thought of someone walking barefoot or dragging themselves through the woods at 3 in the morning felt worse than any animal explanation I tried to force myself to believe. We packed fast. Every bag, every item, shoved back into the car within minutes. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the edge of the woods, expecting to see movement, but the forest was still, heavy with silence again. The door to the bedroom stayed scratched, and the prints stayed wet, like a reminder we couldn't ignore. Driving down the gravel road, I felt relief only once the cabin disappeared from view behind the trees. The further we got from it, the easier it was to breathe. But the image stayed clear in my mind. The clawed marks down the bedroom door, the heavy, mud-stained smears across the porch, the certainty that something had come right up to where we slept, pressing itself against the door in the dark. What made it worse was not knowing if it was a person, if it was someone living in those woods, watching cabins for easy prey, or if it was some animal I couldn't recognize, testing the walls for weakness. Both answers were bad. Both stayed with me. When I think about that night now, I don't remember the cabin as the quiet escape we booked. I remember the sound, the steady scrape of something dragging across wood, patient and unhurried, like it had all the time in the world. And I remember the prints that didn't belong to anything I could name, leading away into a forest that would never give answers back. We rented the cabin because it was advertised as rustic and private, a place to get away from the noise of the city and spend time together as a family. It sat at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by trees that closed in on every side, with no neighbors in sight. The photos made it look cozy. Wood-paneled walls, a stone fireplace, and a small porch with old rocking chairs. When we pulled in, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. The kind of quiet where even the sound of closing a car door felt too loud. The cabin itself was older than I expected. The boards on the porch sagged under our weight, and the paint on the trim was faded and peeling. Inside, the air smelled faintly of damp wood and something musty that lingered in the corners. Still, it was clean enough, and we convinced ourselves that was part of the charm. We unpacked our bags, set up in the bedrooms, and tried to settle into the idea of being off the grid for a few days. The bathroom was small, tucked at the back of the cabin. It had a single bulb overhead that gave off weak yellow light, a sink with a chipped porcelain basin, and a shower with a curtain that stuck to your skin when you moved. The first time I used it, I noticed something strange. Just above the shower, near the ceiling, there was a tiny hole in the wooden wall. At first I thought it might be from an old nail or a knot in the wood that had popped out. It was perfectly round, though, and about the size of a pencil. I didn't think much of it at first. Cabins get beat up over time, and I figured it was just part of the wear. But when I leaned in closer, it looked too clean, too deliberate. The edges weren't jagged like broken wood. They were sharp and neat, drilled through with precision. I could see darkness behind it, not just the inside of the wood. Something about it unsettled me. Later, while brushing my teeth, I stood on my toes and peered closer. That's when I noticed a faint glint, just a pinprick of reflection from inside the hole. It looked metallic like a lens. My stomach dropped. I stared for a long time, frozen, my toothbrush still in my mouth. When I finally moved, I reached up and covered the hole with my thumb. I couldn't shake the idea of what I had just seen. The next morning, while everyone was outside, I brought a chair into the bathroom and stood on it. With the help of a pocket knife, I chipped at the wood around the hole, widening it enough to see what was hidden behind. My worst fear was confirmed. There was a small black camera lens wired into the wall, pointing directly into the bathroom. I followed the wires with my eyes. They disappeared into the gap between the panels, running deeper into the cabin. I felt sick. My chest tightened, and the back of my neck prickled like I was being watched right then. I climbed down from the chair, my hands shaking. The thought that someone had been recording us, watching us without us knowing, made my skin crawl. It wasn't just me that had used that bathroom. My whole family had. I couldn't stop thinking about who had put it there. The cabin was privately owned, rented out online. Maybe it was the owner. Maybe it was someone who had stayed here before. Either way, the wires had to go somewhere. I needed to know. I went outside and circled the cabin slowly, pretending like I was just taking in the trees, though my eyes were fixed on the base of the walls. On the far side, near the back corner, I spotted where the wires poked out beneath the siding. They were bundled together with black tape, then ran down into the ground. The dirt had been disturbed, a shallow trench filled back in carelessly, leading toward the tree line. I crouched down and touched the soil. It was loose, as if someone had dug there recently. The wires disappeared into it, snaking underground toward the woods. My first thought was that there had to be a power source, maybe even some kind of hidden storage device out there. The idea that whoever set it up might come back to check on it made me feel exposed. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, felt like someone moving through the dark. The bathroom door stayed closed, and I couldn't bring myself to look at the hole again. The thought of the lens sitting there, still pointing in, was enough to keep me tense and awake. In the morning, I went back outside to follow the trench. The wires led into the trees, down a slope behind the cabin, until the dirt gave way to pine needles. I traced it for maybe 50 feet before I saw where they surfaced again. A small wooden box was half buried beneath the roots of a tree, covered with branches and leaves as if someone had tried to hide it. I dug it out with my hands. Inside was a recorder, the kind that could run for days at a time. The wires fed into it neatly. My stomach churned as I imagined how many hours of footage were inside, how many families before us had been watched without knowing. I felt an overwhelming urge to smash it right there, but another thought cut through me. If someone had set this up, they would notice if it was destroyed. They might even come looking. I put the box back, covering it the way it had been, and hurried back to the cabin. Every step felt heavier, my ears straining for any sign that I wasn't alone. We packed our things that day. It wasn't a calm, slow process. We shoved clothes into bags, stuffed food into grocery sacks, and carried everything out to the car as fast as we could. I didn't even look back into the bathroom. Couldn't. The entire time I felt the weight of eyes on me, though I couldn't prove if it was just my imagination or something real. Driving away down that gravel road, I finally let myself breathe, but it was shallow and uneven. The forest around us looked endless, like someone could be standing between the trees at any turn. I couldn't shake the thought that whoever put that camera there had been close by, maybe even watching while we discovered it. When we reached the main road, the relief came in a wave, but the unease never fully left. Even now, the thought follows me. Somewhere out there, hidden in a box beneath a tree, is a recorder full of private moments that should never have been captured. Someone chose to place it there, someone with a reason, and that person still knows exactly what they did. The cabin was supposed to be rustic, quiet, and safe. Instead, it was a place where someone had turned privacy into a trap, where a tiny drilled hole above a bathroom carried the weight of something far darker. What stayed with me most wasn't the hole or even the wires. It was the feeling that whoever set it up hadn't stopped. That cabin might still be listed as rustic and private, waiting for the next family to rent it, never knowing they're being watched. I rented the cabin because it was supposed to be simple, quiet, and isolated. Exactly what I wanted after weeks of long hikes and crowded trail shelters. It sat a few miles off the main road, tucked between tall pines and thick brush, the kind of place you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. The listing said rustic but comfortable, and that was about right. One small bedroom, a kitchen with an old wood stove, and a main room with uneven floors and a sagging couch. It wasn't fancy, but it had a roof for walls and a lock on the door. That was enough for me. I arrived in the late afternoon after hiking all day. The air was damp, the woods still holding onto the cool of early spring. The cabin smelled of dust and wood smoke, like it hadn't been used much over the winter. I put my pack down in the corner and walked through the rooms, getting a feel for the place. The floor creaked loudly in spots, especially in the main room where the boards were warped from age. I made a mental note to watch my step at night so I wouldn't trip over anything. After cooking a quick meal on the stove and cleaning up, I decided to sit down and write in my own journal. I always kept notes when I hiked, where I had been, what the weather was like, things I saw along the trail. I set my notebook on the table and pulled the chair closer. But when I leaned forward, I felt the board beneath my feet shift slightly. It was subtle, just enough to make me pause. I slid my chair back and crouched down. One of the floorboards near the table wasn't fixed in place like the others. The edge of it lifted just enough to show a dark seam. I pressed it with my hand, and it moved again, rocking slightly under the pressure. Curiosity got the better of me. I hooked my fingers under the edge and pulled. With a little effort, the board came up, revealing a shallow gap beneath. First, I thought it was empty, just a void in the foundation. But then I saw it. An old notebook, lying flat in the dust. It was covered in a thin layer of grime, the edges curled and yellowed. I reached in, brushed it off, and pulled it out into the light. The cover was plain brown, stiff with age, no writing on the outside. I sat back in the chair and opened it. Inside, the pages were filled with careful handwriting. Each entry was short, just a date, a time, and a name. Some included how many people were with them. Others had small notes, like couple from Ohio or family of 4. The handwriting never changed. Page after page, year after year, the entries continued. At first, I assumed it was some kind of guest log like cabins sometimes have, a quirky tradition, but something about it didn't fit. These weren't messages or reflections left by visitors. They were records, all written by the same hand. Precise, neat, unemotional. Whoever kept this wasn't jotting down memories. It looked more like tracking. I flipped through slowly, my stomach tightening with each page. The entries stretched back decades. Every few days, sometimes weeks, new names and dates appeared. Always consistent, never skipped. And then I reached the most recent pages. The final entry was dated the same day I had arrived. The time matched the late afternoon, and beneath it was my name. My full name spelled correctly. My chest went cold. I hadn't told anyone my exact arrival time. No one had been at the cabin when I got there. The key was left in the lockbox, just like the rental instructions said. But here it was, written down hours before I even knew I'd stop moving for the day. I closed the notebook and just sat there, staring at it. My breathing sounded too loud in the empty room. I thought back to when I arrived. Had someone been watching me from the trees? Had they followed me down the trail without me noticing? The woods around the cabin had seemed still, but that didn't mean much. You can hide a lot in silence. I picked the notebook back up and flipped through again, searching for any detail I might have missed. Some names had been crossed out with a single line, though most were left untouched. A few had question marks beside them. I didn't recognize any of the names, but the consistency was unsettling. Whoever wrote this had been keeping track of every single person who stayed here for years, maybe longer. The more I thought about it, the worse it felt. This wasn't some harmless curiosity. Somebody had gone through the trouble of pulling up the floor, hiding this log, and keeping it up to date. That meant they had access to the cabin, and not just once, they came back regularly. The fact that my name was already inside proved it. They weren't behind me, they were ahead of me. I checked the windows, making sure the curtains were drawn. My hands shook as I walked the small space, double-checking the locks. Both doors were bolted, but the old wood didn't give me much confidence. If someone wanted in badly enough, they could get in. The idea of lying down in that bedroom and pretending to sleep while someone else might be watching from the woods, or worse, waiting for me to drift off, made my stomach twist. The night dragged on slow. Every creak in the walls sounded sharper. I couldn't tell if the noises were just the old cabin settling or footsteps outside on the porch. I sat at the table with the notebook in front of me, staring at it like it would give me an answer. The one thing I knew was that I couldn't stay there another night. As soon as the first light started bleeding through the trees, I packed. I shoved my gear into my bag without folding or sorting. My only thought was to get out as fast as I could. The notebook sat on the table where I had left it, the floorboard still open. For a moment, I considered taking it with me, proof of what I had found. But the thought of carrying it made me feel like I was holding something that didn't belong to me, something that someone might come looking for. I left it where it was, slid the floorboard back into place, and forced myself to walk out the door. The morning air was cold and damp, but it felt better than the stale air inside. My legs moved fast, carrying me down the trail toward the road where I had left my car. I didn't stop to look back at the cabin. I didn't want to. By the time I reached the car, the sun had cleared the trees, and the forest looked less threatening. But the unease never lifted. Driving away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone stepping out from the woods, watching me leave. What stays with me most isn't the fact that I found the notebook. It's knowing that my name is in it now, written in the same steady handwriting as all the others. I don't know who wrote it or why, but whoever they are, they know I was there. They knew before I even realized it myself. And that means somewhere, someone is keeping track. Not just of me, but of everyone who passes through that cabin. I'll never go back, but I can't shake the feeling that the notebook is still there, waiting under that loose floorboard, waiting for the next name to be added. I had rented the cabin for a week, a small wooden place deep in the Rockies. I wanted quiet, and the listing promised it. The cabin sat on a slope, surrounded by tall pines, with a narrow dirt road that climbed up from the valley and ended right at the porch. No neighbors, no passing traffic, nothing but the wind and the trees. When I arrived, the weather was clear, but the forecast warned of heavy snow. I thought nothing of it. A snowstorm in the Rockies didn't surprise me. The cabin itself was sturdy, with thick walls, a fireplace, and a single bedroom. It wasn't big, but it felt solid. Inside smelled of smoke and pine sap, and the wood floors creaked under my boots. I unpacked, started a fire, and spent the first couple of days hiking short trails and reading by the fire at night. It was the kind of escape I wanted, the kind where time stretched and the noise of normal life fell away. Then the storm came. It started with light flakes in the afternoon and turned heavy by nightfall. The wind howled across the roof, rattling the shutters, and the snow came down so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the porch. I went to bed listening to the storm batter the cabin, and when I woke the next morning, everything outside was buried. The ground was covered in a deep, white sheet, unbroken and smooth. The forest hushed beneath the weight of it. I put on my coat and boots to go outside, just to take it in. The air was sharp and cold, my breath turning to clouds in front of me. The snow crunched under my weight as I stepped off the porch, but then I noticed something strange. There were footprints already in the snow. Not mine, I had just stepped out. These were older, packed hard, not softened by fresh fall. They started near the edge of the porch and curved around the side of the cabin. A single set of prints, boots, not bare feet or animal tracks. The stride was steady, the steps heavy, the tread clear. I followed them slowly, my stomach tightening. The prints circled the cabin. I walked around with them, expecting to see where they led away, but they never did. They looped around once, then twice, then again and again. Dozens of circles all the way around the cabin, packed into the snow like someone had spent hours walking in endless loops. There were no breaks, no path leading off into the trees, no second set of tracks. Just one person, walking round and round in the dark, while I had been inside, sleeping through the storm. I stopped walking and stood still, listening. The forest was silent, the air heavy with cold. I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching. But the woods were empty. The only sound was the faint groan of the trees shifting under the snow. I went back inside and bolted the door. For the rest of that morning, I couldn't focus on anything else. I kept going to the window, peering out at the white ground, those same circles locked into place like a mark around the cabin. I tried to reason it out. Maybe it was a hunter. Maybe someone caught in the storm who thought the cabin was empty and kept moving to stay warm. But if that were true, where did they go? There was no sign of them leaving. That night, I built the fire higher and kept the lights on. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind against the shutters made me tense. I didn't sleep much. By morning, the snow had stopped again. The sky was pale and clear, and the trees dripped with melting ice. I went to the window and froze. There were new prints, another circle, fresher than before, cutting into the snow alongside the old ones. My chest tightened as I realized what it meant. Someone had been out there again, walking that same path, circling the cabin while I sat inside with the fire burning. I checked every lock again, even though I already knew they were secure. The doors were solid, the windows latched. But the idea that someone had stood just feet away from me, looping around and around, gnawed at me. I couldn't understand the purpose of it. Why circle without stopping? Why never leave a trail away? That day, I didn't go outside. I stayed in, keeping watch from the windows. The woods looked still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. I moved from room to room, restless, listening hard for anything beyond the wind. Nothing came. When night fell again, the fear pressed down harder. I left the lights off this time, sitting in the dark by the window, watching the snow-lit yard. My eyes burned from staring too long, but I refused to look away. Hours passed. Then I saw it. Movement. A figure passed between the trees, faint and dark against the snow. I couldn't make out details, but the shape was human, tall enough to stand out clearly against the pale background. It didn't approach. It didn't try to come closer. It just moved in that same slow circle, pacing the path that had already been pressed deep into the snow. Step after step, round and round, deliberate and unhurried. I ducked back from the window, heart pounding. Whoever it was, they weren't wandering lost. They knew exactly where they were, exactly what they were doing. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat against the wall with a heavy fire poker in my hand, the fire burning low, listening for the crunch of boots outside. By dawn, I was shaking with exhaustion, my body stiff from sitting tense for so long. When the light finally came, I looked outside again. The prints were there, deeper, fresher, circling again and again. But this time, there was something worse. In the middle of the circle, right at the edge of the porch, the snow was disturbed. A single set of prints led up to the bottom step, stopped there, and then turned back into the loop. Whoever it was had come closer, close enough to reach out and touch the cabin, before going back to their endless pacing. That was enough for me. I packed what I could in minutes, throwing gear into my bag without care. I couldn't stay another night, not with whoever that was out there. I shoved my things into the car, the cold biting through my gloves, and backed down the long snow-covered road as fast as I dared. The cabin disappeared behind the trees, but the image of those circles in the snow stayed in my mind. Whoever made them had no interest in leaving. They had no reason to. They weren't lost. They weren't seeking help. They were doing exactly what they wanted, circling, always circling, watching whoever stayed inside. Even now, what unsettles me most isn't what I saw. It's what I didn't. The prints never led away. They stayed there in endless loops around that cabin in the Rockies, waiting for whoever comes next. I booked the cabin for a week thinking it would be a quiet break for me, my wife, and our kids. It was tucked back in the woods, a long drive off a dirt road, with no neighbors close by. It looked perfect from the pictures. Rustic but comfortable, with enough space for us to spread out. When we arrived, it felt cozy, though the air inside was stale, like it hadn't been aired out in a long time. Still, the kids ran from room to room, picking beds, and my wife started unpacking groceries. I set a fire in the wood stove, the smell of smoke mixing with the pine outside. The first night was calm. The cabin creaked a little, as all old places do. The wind rattled the trees, and the logs in the stove popped. I didn't think much of it, but around midnight, lying awake, I thought I heard faint noises above us, like soft shuffling. At first, I thought it was a squirrel or a raccoon. Maybe something had gotten into the roof. I didn't wake anyone. I just told myself it was part of being in the woods. The next morning, I looked outside expecting to see animal tracks on the ground, or maybe some sign of something chewing near the eaves. There was nothing. The snow was undisturbed. The roof had no fresh marks. I brushed it off and went about the day. But the sounds continued. Every night, after things got quiet, I'd hear it again. Soft thuds, faint dragging, a kind of shifting above the ceiling. It wasn't constant, but it was enough to catch my attention every time I started to drift off. My wife mentioned it too on the third night. She said it woke her up, and she thought maybe raccoons had a nest up there. I agreed at first because it was the most reasonable explanation, but I started to feel uneasy. The noises were heavier than I'd expect from small animals. One afternoon, while the kids played outside, I decided to check around the cabin more carefully. There was a hatch above the hallway that led to an unfinished loft space. No stairs, just a square opening in the ceiling. I hadn't thought about it since we arrived. I dragged a chair over, pushed up on the cover, and a rush of cold, dusty air came down. I shined a flashlight inside. At first, all I saw were rafters and insulation, the kind of raw wood space you'd expect in an unfinished attic. But when I moved the light across the far side, I froze. There was a pile of blankets and an old sleeping bag tucked into the corner. Around it, scattered food wrappers, some half-crushed water bottles, and something else that made my stomach tighten. A small knife lying across the blankets. I lowered the hatch quickly and stood there, the chair wobbling under me. My heart pounded. This wasn't animals. Someone had been staying up there. I didn't know if they were still up there at that very moment, watching me shine the light. I didn't hear anything moving when I looked, but that didn't calm me. I went outside and called my wife over quietly, trying not to alarm the kids. I told her what I found. Her face went pale. She wanted to pack up immediately, but we were miles from town, and the sun was already starting to sink. Driving icy back roads at night wasn't something I wanted to risk with the kids. I told her we'd lock everything up, keep the fire going, and leave first thing in the morning. That night was the longest of my life. Couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, put me on edge. I kept listening for movement above us. A few times, I swore I heard its soft, deliberate shifting, like weight pressing against the beams. My wife lay stiff beside me, pretending to sleep, but I knew she was awake too. At one point, maybe around 2 in the morning, I heard a faint scrape. It wasn't above us this time. It was near the hatch. I sat up slowly, staring at the dark outline of the ceiling. I couldn't see anything, but the sound sent a chill through me. I got up, checked the locks again, and sat by the window with the firelight flickering behind me, just waiting for the night to end. Morning finally came. The kids woke up cheerful, oblivious, asking for breakfast. My wife and I didn't tell them anything, just hurriedly packed up our things. Before leaving, I went back to the hatch one more time, shining the flashlight inside. The pile of blankets looked the same, but some of the wrappers were in a slightly different spot, as if someone had shifted them around since the day before. I didn't see anyone, but the silence in that space felt heavier than before, like the air itself was watching. We loaded the car fast and drove down the snowy road, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than usual. When we reached town, I went straight to the rental office. I told them everything, down to the smallest detail. They didn't say much, just gave each other nervous looks and told me they'd take care of it. I could tell by their reaction that this wasn't the first time something strange had happened with that cabin. The drive home felt long and tense. Even in the safety of daylight, I kept thinking about that loft, about the sleeping bag tucked into the shadows, the knife lying there like a warning, about the noises that only came after dark. The worst part was knowing I couldn't prove if someone had been up there during the nights we stayed. Maybe they were gone before we arrived. Maybe they were hiding in silence while my family slept below. I'll never know for sure, but I can still hear those faint steps above the ceiling when I think back to that week. I can still see the dust floating in the beam of my flashlight, landing on the pile of blankets that weren't supposed to be there. And I know, without question, that cabin was not empty while we were there. That thought stays with me, and I don't think it will ever leave.